Eleanor Sullivan's shovel struck frozen earth for the 100th time that morning. Her hands bled through worn gloves, crimson drops falling onto pristine snow. The Montana Territory wind cut through her thin coat like a preacher's judgment, cold and unforgiving. 20 degrees below zero, and still she dug, marking the foundation corners of what would someday be a cabin. Her cabin, her new beginning. Behind her, a wagon held everything she owned: a cast iron stove worth $4.75, two dresses, a heavy pot, and her husband's grave marker wrapped in canvas so she wouldn't have to see his name every time she turned around. Daniel Sullivan, beloved husband, 1820-1877. Pneumonia had taken him the same winter the bank took their farm. Interest rates climbing from 4 to 11% after the Panic of '73 had sealed their fate, along with dozens of other families across Pennsylvania. She'd brought Daniel this far. Couldn't leave him at the foreclosed farm where they'd lost everything. 60 miles from the nearest bank, in a territory where most people couldn't read the contracts they signed, Eleanor had chosen this patch of earth to begin again. From her coat pocket, she pulled her daughter's letter, the paper worn thin from countless readings, the words burning into memory. "Don't write again, Mother. You embarrass us. You should have sold the farm sooner, should have moved east with me and Charles, should have been sensible instead of stubborn." The letter ended without love or even sincerely. Just Catherine's name, as if she were addressing a stranger. Eleanor used her husband's old compass to measure the corner angles. Perfect 90 degrees. Daniel had taught her that much. "A house built on a crooked foundation will never stand straight," he'd said. Daniel had served with the 12th Pennsylvania during the war, taken a mini-A ball at Gettysburg that left him with a limp and nightmares that never quite faded. "Ain't nobody coming to save you, Eleanor," she whispered to the empty land. "Do the work." She drove the shovel down again. It bounced off a root. She fell to her knees, and for one moment, just one, she let herself weep. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, picked up the shovel. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching. Ethan Hayes sat his horse on the pine ridge above, coffee cups steaming in the November dawn. He'd been watching 3 days now. Watched her mark the foundation corners with stakes and string. Watched her collapse twice and rise both times. Watched her talk to herself when she thought no one could hear. Through his Navy spyglass, a remnant from another life, he studied her work. Her stake placement was sound, if ambitious for a woman alone. The corners were square, the dimensions practical for Montana winters. The site itself well chosen, sheltered from the north wind by the ridge, with the creek nearby for water. A woman that stubborn either survives or takes the whole mountain down with her, he thought. He'd known women like her. Hell, he'd been married to one. Sarah had that same fire, worked herself to the bone, and never complained. Not even when the baby came too early. Not even when she knew she was dying. 10 years ago now. Ethan had been riding for supplies, fighting through a blizzard much like this one was threatening to become. By the time he returned, Sarah was gone, and their son had lived just 2 hours, just long enough for Ethan to hold him once. A man shouldn't let a widow freeze to death, but a man also shouldn't insult her pride. There was a code to these things, and out here, where law was distant and honor was everything, the West had rules all its own. Ethan had already measured the foundation she'd marked. During the night, he'd cut timber to the exact dimensions she would need. Good pine, straight and strong, no knots. The kind that cost $1.85 per length at McMaster's store in Pine Creek. The kind she couldn't afford. He finished his coffee, set the cup on his saddle horn. Time to stop watching. He mounted his horse and started down the ridge, his wagon loaded with the timber he'd cut yesterday, a coil of manila rope, and a box of hand-forged nails. The cold bit at his face, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The scars on his hands, souvenirs from years in the silver mines before he'd saved enough for his ranch, ached in the cold. At 52, he felt the Montana winters in his bones, but he knew how to survive them. He wondered if she did. Eleanor looked up when she heard hoofbeats. Her hand went to the shovel, gripping it like a weapon. Her eyes were wild but proud, her face weathered and lined, her gray hair escaping a severe bun. She planted the shovel in the dirt between them like a fence. "I don't need help," she called out before Ethan was even close enough to hear properly. He reined in 10 feet away, tipped his hat, didn't dismount. He just waited, assessing. Her foundation trench was shallow, the stakes uneven, her hands raw and bleeding. She had determination, but determination alone wouldn't build a cabin before the deep winter set in. "Ma'am," he said, "brought lumber, had too much for my project, figured you could use it. I didn't ask for charity. Didn't offer any." His voice was even, matter of fact. "Just can't watch good lumber go to waste on account of pride." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She'd heard that tone before from bankers, from neighbors, from her own daughter. The tone that said, "You can't do this alone." "I've managed fine so far." Ethan glanced at the shallow foundation trench, the crooked stakes, her bleeding hands. He didn't say a word, didn't have to. He walked to his wagon and started unloading timber, stacked it neatly beside her wagon. 16 logs, a coil of rope, a box of nails. He worked methodically, each movement precise and economical, the hallmark of a man who had done physical labor all his life. "I don't want your pity," Eleanor said. "Good, I ain't offering that either." "Then what do you want?" Ethan paused, looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were gray, tired, but not unkind. Deep lines fanned from their corners, carved by sun and wind and years. "Nothing, ma'am, just doing what's right." She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already climbing back onto his wagon. "Your choice whether to use it or burn it," he said, then clicked to his horse and rode away without waiting for an answer. Eleanor stood alone in the cold, staring at the pile of timber. She wanted to be angry, wanted to load it back onto his wagon and leave it at his property line. But the truth was, she needed it. That night, she sat by her campfire and ran her hands over the smooth wood. It was good lumber, straight grain, no knots, the kind of wood that cost money she didn't have. She cried for the first time in months, not because she was grateful, but because kindness felt like a debt she didn't know how to repay. In her experience, every good thing came with a price, usually paid twice over in loss. Her parents, her farm, her husband, her daughter's love. What would this cost? At dawn, Eleanor picked up the saw, Daniel's old crosscut that had followed her from Pennsylvania. She began cutting the first log, struggling with the weight and angle. The saw kept binding in the wood. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Ethan Hayes watching again from the ridge. He made no move to approach, just observed. After an hour of fighting with the saw, she straightened, hands on her lower back, frustration evident in every line of her body. Ethan appeared as if conjured by her difficulty, riding down slowly. This time he dismounted, approaching with the careful manner of someone who doesn't wish to startle. "Cut with the grain, not against it," he said, demonstrating the proper angle. "Wood wants to split a certain way. Fight it and you'll work twice as hard." "I know how to use a saw," Eleanor replied, but her tone lacked conviction. Ethan nodded, taking no offense. "My father taught me to build when I was 10. Said a man needed to know how to make shelter anywhere. He showed her how to notch the logs for corners, the technique passed down from when men built cabins without milled lumber or factory nails." Eleanor watched, reluctantly absorbing the lesson. "Why are you helping me?" "Winter's coming. Cabin needs to be up before the deep snow." They worked side by side, with Ethan disguising his help as teaching. He showed her how to leverage the weight of the logs, how to test for level using water in a shallow pan, how to calculate the roof angle to shed heavy snow. By noon, Eleanor had the first log braced in place for what would become the north wall. It was heavy, too heavy. She struggled, lost her grip, and it fell. She landed hard on her back, the wind knocked out of her. When she finally sat up, gasping, she looked toward the ridge. Ethan was there watching. This time, she didn't tell him to leave. He rode down without a word, dismounted, walked to the fallen log, and lifted one end. "On 3, he said. Eleanor grabbed the other end. They lifted together. When the log settled into place, Ethan stepped back and nodded once. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and said the words that would change everything. "I'm too old to start again," Eleanor whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since leaving Pennsylvania. Ethan smiled. It was a sad smile, a knowing smile, the smile of a man who'd lost things too. "Then let's begin anyway." The blizzard came on fast. One moment Eleanor was nailing the fourth wall into place, and the next the sky went white. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, the wind howling through the valley like a living thing, hungry and mean. 4 feet of snow fell in hours, burying the landscape in a white shroud. She tried to brace the walls, but the wet snow was too heavy. The north wall buckled, then collapsed, taking 2 days of work with it. Eleanor stood in the wreckage, numb, not from the cold, from the weight of it all, the loss, the exhaustion, the creeping certainty that she'd come all this way just to fail. The whiteout conditions created a world without horizon, where sky and earth blended into a single blank canvas. In such conditions, men lost their way between house and barn, freezing to death within yards of safety. Eleanor knew the signs of hypothermia, had seen it take neighbors during Pennsylvania winters. The confusion, the paradoxical feeling of heat, the irresistible urge to sleep. Then she heard hoofbeats. 5 riders came through the storm like ghosts. Ethan Hayes in the lead, 4 ranch hands behind him. They didn't ask permission, didn't wait for her to argue. They just started working by lantern light. Henry Jackson, Ethan's ranch foreman, directed operations with hand signals. A former slave from Mississippi, nearly 70, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that missed nothing. Miguel Vasquez, a Mexican vaquero whose knowledge of wood and knife skills were unmatched in 3 territories. The Cooper brothers, Abe and Isaac, blacksmiths who could turn raw metal into tools with an artist's precision. They rebuilt what had taken her 3 days and 4 hours. Using a pulley system constructed from rope and tree limbs, they raised the wall beams. Ethan directed with hand signals. Lift, brace, nail, move. His men worked with the efficiency of soldiers, and by midnight, the 4 walls stood solid once more. When it was done, Ethan built a fire inside the half-finished cabin. His men rode back to the ranch. He stayed. Eleanor tried to press coins into his hand. I have to pay you. No, ma'am. I can't owe a man I don't know. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he poured 2 cups of coffee from his canteen and handed her one. Then learn to know me, he said. They sat by the fire, the storm raging outside. The warmth between them had nothing to do with the flames. Why help me? Eleanor finally asked. Ethan stared into his cup. Because nobody helped me when I needed it. I lived, but I didn't heal. What happened? Lost my wife 10 years back. She died in childbirth. Baby boy lived 2 hours, just long enough for me to hold him once. Eleanor's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Me too. He looked up. What about you? Why here? Why alone? Lost the farm. Bank took it. My husband. She stopped, swallowed. He died of pneumonia the same winter. My daughter married and moved east. Said I embarrassed her by refusing to sell sooner. So you came here to prove something? No, Eleanor shook her head. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. She paused, considering her words. At first, but now I think I came here to prove to myself that I'm not too old, not too broken, not too alone, Ethan finished. Eleanor nodded. They didn't speak for a while after that, just sat in the warmth, listening to the wind. At some point, Ethan's head drooped against her shoulder. At some point, Eleanor's hand found his. They slept sitting up, leaning against each other for warmth. When morning came, the storm had buried the cabin to the windowsills in snow. They dug out together, laughing at the absurdity of it, covered in snow, exhausted, alive. Well, Ethan said, brushing ice from his beard, we know the roof holds. Eleanor smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. And for the first time since her husband died, she let herself imagine a future that didn't feel like punishment. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin's interior in amber shadows. Outside, the wind had eased, leaving behind a muffled silence that came only with deep snow. Ethan added another log, sparks spiraling upward. I keep thinking, he said, his voice rough with emotion, if I'd been faster, if I'd gotten the doctor sooner, maybe Sarah would have lived. Maybe our son would have lived. In the flickering light, Eleanor saw the pain etched into every line of his face, a decade old but still raw. You can't know that, she said gently. I was gone when she needed me most. You were trying to save her, getting medicine. Ethan shook his head. Doesn't matter why I wasn't there. I wasn't there. Eleanor understood that guilt. She'd carried her own version since Daniel's death. The what-ifs that haunted sleepless nights. What if she'd recognized the pneumonia sooner? What if she'd been able to afford better medicine? The last letter from my daughter, Eleanor said, pulling the worn paper from her pocket, came 3 years ago. She wrote that I embarrassed her, that I should have been someone different. Ethan looked up. Different how? More practical, less stubborn. Someone who would sell the farm when her husband died instead of trying to run it alone. Eleanor smoothed the letter with trembling fingers. She was right in a way. I did lose the farm in the end. But you fought for it first, Ethan said. There's honor in that. Is there, or just pride? Sometimes they're the same thing. Eleanor returned the letter to her pocket. I came here to prove Catherine wrong. to prove I could still build something. But now I think I came here to prove myself right, that I'm not too old, not too broken, not too alone," Ethan finished again. Eleanor nodded. They sat in silence, the storm raging outside. Two broken people finding unexpected comfort in shared pain. Ruth Miller came by the cabin a week later. She was the school teacher in Pine Creek, a small woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile. She brought fresh bread and apologies for not welcoming Eleanor to the area sooner. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said carefully, glancing around at the progress on the cabin, "I wanted to welcome you, but I also wanted to warn you." "Warn me?" Eleanor paused in her work, wiping sawdust from her hands. Ruth glanced at the cabin, then back at Eleanor. "Ethan Hayes is a good man, one of the best. But people talk. A widow and a widower working alone together." Eleanor's face hardened. "Let them talk." "I'm not judging," Ruth touched her arm gently. "I'm just saying be careful. This town can be cruel." Reverend Thomas mentioned an improper situation in his sermon Sunday. The Victorian-era's strict social codes had followed the settlers west, though often unevenly applied. A widow Eleanor's age was expected to live with family, not stake an independent claim. Proper mourning periods, appropriate behavior, the rules were clear, if restrictive. "At my age," Eleanor said with a bitter laugh, "what is there left to lose? Reputation. I've been a respectable woman for 40 years, and what has it gotten me?" Ruth looked pained. "I understand, truly, but small towns don't live by law so much as by gossip, and gossip can turn dangerous." After Ruth left, Eleanor stood in the doorway of her cabin, looking at the solid walls Ethan had helped build. She thought about his question from that night by the fire. Why here? Why alone? And she realized the answer had changed. She wasn't alone anymore. 3 weeks passed like a long exhale. Eleanor and Ethan fell into a rhythm. She measured, he cut. She hammered, he lifted. They didn't need words anymore, just the language of work, of two people who'd learned each other's pace. Ethan taught Eleanor how to create a gravity-fed water system from the creek, using wooden pipes sealed with pitch. Eleanor showed him how to preserve meat without salt, using smoke and cold. Together they dug a root cellar for the winter months ahead. The cabin took shape. Roof beams rose against the winter sky. The door frames settled into place. Ethan laid the chimney stones while Eleanor mixed mortar, and by the time December arrived, the structure stood complete, just needed finishing touches. One evening, as they sat drinking coffee in the fading light, Eleanor teased Ethan about a row of crooked nails in the doorframe. "You do that on purpose?" she asked. "Or is your eye going bad?" Ethan looked at the nails, then at her and laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine. "I'll fix it tomorrow." "Don't bother. Gives the place character." He smiled. "That what we're calling it now?" It was a small moment, but it mattered. That night, Eleanor caught herself humming while she cleaned her dishes. The realization hit her like a slap. She was happy, actually happy, and that terrified her. Happiness was a debt. Every good thing she'd ever had, she'd paid for twice over in loss. Her parents, her farm, her husband, her daughter's love. What would this cost? The next morning, Ethan mentioned he'd be gone 2 days. Cattle sale in Bozeman. Routine trip. Eleanor's hands shook as she poured his coffee. "You worried I won't come back?" Ethan asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Finally, "I'm worried I'll need you to." Ethan reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. "I'll come back," he said. And he did, but something had shifted. Eleanor felt it in her chest, a loosening, a dangerous softness. She was starting to need him. Not just his help, him. The man who showed up at dawn and stayed past dusk. The man who fixed her mistakes without mentioning them. The man who'd lost everything just like her, and somehow still believed in beginning again. A cabin's just timber till two people call it home, she thought, and she was starting to think of this place, their work, as home. The Pine Creek Baptist Church stood at the heart of the small town, its white clapboard sides gleaming in the winter sun. Inside, the congregation gathered for Sunday service. Families arranged according to status and standing, the wealthiest near the front, the poorest and newest settlers toward the back. Reverend Parashers, thin as a whip with a voice like a rusty hinge, stood at the pulpit, his Bible open to Proverbs. Eleanor had not attended, but Ruth Miller had. She told Eleanor afterward what had been said. He spoke of the virtue of women, quoting Proverbs 31. Then he turned to modern improprieties, and though he never named you or Ethan directly, everyone knew who he meant. The women of the church had split into factions. Some, mostly the older widows who understood the harsh realities of frontier life, silently supported Eleanor. Others, led by the banker's wife, openly condemned what they saw as scandalous behavior. Ethan, who rarely attended church, had heard about the sermon from his ranch hands. True to his nature, he hadn't argued or defended himself publicly, but he had visited Reverend Thomas privately. "Judge me if you want," he told the preacher, "but leave her be." The following evening, he rode to her cabin, found her sitting on the front step, staring at nothing. Snow had begun to fall again, dusting her shoulders and hair. "They came to your ranch too?" she asked without looking up. Ethan nodded. "You should stop coming," Eleanor said quietly. "What?" "I won't be the woman who ruins a good man's name." She looked up at him. "You've done enough, Ethan. More than enough. Leave me to finish." "Eleanor, please." Her voice cracked. "Just go." Ethan stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to his horse. Before he mounted, he looked back. "This ain't finished." "Yes," Eleanor said, "it is." He rode away. As winter deepened and Eleanor fought her solitary battle against cold and hunger, a new threat emerged from an unexpected direction. Warren Pierce arrived in Pine Creek on a Tuesday, during the worst of the December cold. He came not on horseback like most travelers, but in a covered carriage, black lacquered sides gleaming against the snow. The carriage alone announced him as someone of consequence, someone with money and the power it bought in frontier territories. He took a room at the Westward Hotel, the only establishment in Pine Creek that could claim 2 stories and glass windows. Within hours, he had visited the land office, the bank, and the saloon, in that order. Pierce was a land speculator from Bozeman, formerly a Union Pacific Railroad attorney, a man who understood the letter of the law and all its profitable loopholes. In the Silver Dollar Saloon, Pierce stood at the bar in his tailored suit, drinking rye whiskey neat while studying a map of the territory. "Interesting," he said to the bartender, loud enough for others to hear. "Seems there's a new claim up north, registered to a Sullivan, Eleanor." Jack Turner, the Pine Creek bank manager, glanced up from his poker game. "Widow woman, building herself a cabin. Alone?" Pierce raised an eyebrow, folding his map with practiced precision. "Got help from Hayes, Ethan Hayes." This from the blacksmith, Willard, nursing a beer in the corner. "Improper situation," muttered Silas Cooper, the oldest man in the saloon. "Reverend says so." Pierce smiled, revealing teeth too perfect for the frontier, and ordered another whiskey. "Seems unusual. A widow her age staking a claim alone. The Homestead Act of 1862 requires proof of improvement, continuous residency." He spoke like a man sharing common knowledge rather than deploying calculated weapons. "I wonder if she's meeting those requirements." By evening, Pierce had learned everything about Eleanor Sullivan that Pine Creek knew to tell. Her arrival 3 months prior, her age, her lost Pennsylvania farm, the fact that she kept her husband's grave marker in her wagon, and most importantly to Pierce, the exact location of her claim. The next morning, he rode north to see for himself. He found the half-finished cabin easily enough, smoke curling from the chimney. He watched from a distance through field glasses, noting the foundation, the walls, the roof. A respectable effort, especially for a woman her age. He also noted the wagon, the grave marker still wrapped in canvas, and he noted that she worked alone. Pierce approached on a horseback, his mount a large bay stallion that had cost more than some men earned in a year. Eleanor heard the hoofbeats and came out, leaning on a shovel like a cane. She looked thinner than when Ethan had last seen her face gaunt, her clothes hanging loose. "Mrs. Sullivan," Pierce said, tipping his hat. "Warren Pierce, at your service. Impressive work." He looked at the cabin with the way a crow looks at a carcass. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, too tired for social niceties. "I represent certain interests in the territory. I'm authorized to make you an offer for this claim. It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, ma'am. Question is price." He named a figure, low, insulting. "No?" Eleanor turned to go back inside. "Winter doesn't care about your courage, Mrs. Sullivan, and neither do I." Pierce's voice carried a chill that matched the Montana air. "When you change your mind, you know where to find me." He rode off, leaving Eleanor with a sick feeling in her stomach. She knew men like Pierce, men who saw the letter of the law as malleable, who measured human worth in dollars and acres. The railroads were coming, everyone knew it. Where rails went, land values soared, Eleanor's claim sat on a natural pass that would save miles of track and thousands in construction costs if the Union Pacific came through. Pierce knew it too, and he knew something else, something that made Eleanor's isolated cabin all the more valuable. Her land bordered the watershed that controlled water access to three valleys. Whoever owned it could dictate terms to dozens of ranchers and farmers downstream. What Pierce didn't know, what few in Pine Creek knew, was that Eleanor Sullivan had worked as a clerk in the county records office after her husband died. She understood property law better than most men who enforced it. She knew exactly what she had claimed and why it mattered. But knowledge didn't fill her pantry, and pride couldn't keep her warm. Before Ethan had stopped coming, they had fallen into a rhythm of work that felt as natural as breathing. Eleanor measured, Ethan cut. She hammered, he lifted. They didn't need words anymore, just the language of work, of two people who'd learned each other's pace. Ethan had taught Eleanor practical skills for frontier survival. How to construct a gravity-fed water system from the creek using wooden pipes sealed with pine pitch. How to build a cold cellar that maintained temperatures just above freezing even in summer. How to identify the trees that burned hottest and longest. Eleanor had shared her own knowledge. How to preserve vegetables in sand layers. How to make soap using beef tallow and wood ash. How to predict weather changes by watching pine cones open and close. One evening, they had worked on the cabin door together, carefully measuring and hanging the heavy wooden panel. When finished, Eleanor had noticed a row of slightly crooked nails along the frame. "You do that on purpose?" she asked, her tone lighter than it had been in months. "Or is your eye going bad?" Ethan looked at the nails, then at her and laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine. The sound startled them both. "I'll fix it tomorrow." "Don't bother," gives the place character. He smiled. "That what we're calling it now?" It had been a small moment, but it mattered. That night, Eleanor caught herself humming while she cleaned her dishes. The realization hit her like a slap. She was happy, actually happy, and that terrified her. Now, weeks later, Eleanor sat alone in her cabin, the silence so complete she could hear snow falling outside. No humming now, no laughter, just the occasional crack of timber contracting in the cold, like gunshots in the night. She'd built a table from scrap wood, 2 chairs, though she only needed one, force of habit from 40 years of marriage. She'd sewn curtains from one of her old dresses, lined the walls with newsprint for insulation, created all the trappings of home. But a house wasn't a home without people. Eleanor knew that now, knew it in the ache that filled her chest when she set 1 plate instead of 2 for dinner, knew it in the silence that pressed against her ears like cotton wool. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived losing a husband, a farm, and a daughter's love, only to be defeated by her own pride and the whispers of strangers. The walls she'd built to protect Ethan's good name were now the walls of her own tomb. At least then she'd had purpose. The farm to run, the fight against foreclosure. Now she had a cabin she'd built with hands that shook from hunger and cold, and no one to share it with. Outside, the temperature dropped further. Inside, Eleanor wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and tried not to think about what happened to people who died alone in cabins during Montana winters. By spring, someone might find her, frozen solid, preserved by the cold like meat in a smokehouse. She didn't know that 50 miles away in Bozeman, Ethan Hayes was thinking of her too. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the sun reflecting blindingly off fresh snow. The Pine Creek Baptist Church bell rang across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. The church stood at the center of town, white clapboard sides and a simple steeple that pointed heavenward like an accusing finger. Inside, families arranged themselves according to status and standing, the wealthiest near the front, the poorest and newest settlers toward the back. Reverend Hahamas ascended to the pulpit, his Bible open to Proverbs, his face set in stern lines. Ruth Miller, sitting midway back, felt dread pool in her stomach. She had heard rumors of today's sermon topic. Proverbs 31, the Reverend intoned, speaks of the virtuous woman whose price is above rubies. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. He paused, scanning the congregation. Yet in our midst, we face modern improprieties that threaten the very fabric of our God-fearing community. A woman alone, living without male relatives, working alongside an unmarried man, defies the natural order established by our Creator. Though he never named Eleanor or Ethan directly, everyone knew exactly whom he meant. The women of the congregation exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable. Ruth Miller sat straighter, her hands clenched in her lap. She had visited Eleanor just yesterday, brought her bread, and found her alarmingly thin, coughing, the cabin cold because Eleanor lacked strength to chop more wood. The sight had filled Ruth with shame for her own inaction, her silent complicity in the town's judgment. The scripture is clear, Reverend Thomas continued, his voice rising. 1 Timothy 5:14, I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. The widow Sullivan defies this guidance, setting a dangerous example for our daughters. In the back row, Ethan Hayes sat with his hat in his hands. He rarely attended church, but today he'd felt compelled. He listened to the Reverend's words, his face impassive. But those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his hat. After the service, as congregants filed out into the snowy churchyard, Ethan approached Reverend Thomas. He spoke quietly, his words for the preacher alone, but his demeanor made several people pause to watch. Judge me if you want, he said, his voice level, but leave her be. She's harmed no one. The Reverend drew himself up. Mr. Hayes, her very presence, her defiance of proper behavior, harms our community's moral standing. And what of Christian charity? What of judge not, lest ye be judged? Do not presume to quote scripture to me, Mr. Hayes. The woman lives in sin. Ethan's eyes hardened. She lives alone, Reverend, because I respected her wishes and stopped visiting. Where is the sin in solitude? Several women gasped. Ethan Hayes, always so reserved, challenging the Reverend in public. The appearance of impropriety is itself improper, Thomas replied, his voice rising. As community leaders, we must consider how actions appear to others, especially the young and impressionable. And as Christians, Ethan countered, shouldn't we consider the truth rather than appearances? The truth is, Eleanor Sullivan is a widow trying to survive in a harsh land. Nothing more, nothing sinful. The confrontation ended in stalemate, but word spread quickly. By afternoon, Ethan's ranch foreman, old Henry, had heard and pulled him aside after lunch. Boss, folks are talking. It ain't right. You're a good man, but this looks bad. Ethan had said nothing, just nodded and walked away. He knew what he had to do, though it went against everything in him to leave Eleanor alone with winter deepening and her supplies dwindling. That evening, he rode to her cabin, found her sitting on the front step, staring at nothing. Snow had begun to fall again, dusting her shoulders and hair. They came to your ranch too? She asked without looking up. Ethan nodded. You should stop coming, Eleanor said quietly. What? I won't be the woman who ruins a good man's name. She looked up at him. You've done enough, Ethan. More than enough. Leave me to finish. Eleanor, please. Her voice cracked. Just go. Ethan stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to his horse. Before he mounted, he looked back. This ain't finished. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. He rode away. Eleanor watched until he was out of sight, his figure gradually consumed by falling snow. Then she went inside, picked up her hammer, and completed the doorframe. The threshold was solid, square, true. She closed the door firmly and secured it with the crude latch she'd fashioned from scrap wood. Not enough to keep out a determined intruder, but enough to make her isolation complete. She stood outside, unable to cross back into a life she'd just sealed away. A house wasn't a home when you locked yourself out of living. But she didn't go inside. Not that night. She slept under the stars, wrapped in a blanket, too proud to cry and too tired to care. In Pine Creek, whispers circulated about the widow Sullivan. Some said she'd abandoned her claim and fled the territory. Others speculated she might have frozen to death in that half-finished cabin. Few bothered to wonder, fewer still to care, except for Hope. The 8-year-old orphan slipped away from the Willards' house whenever possible, trudging through deepening snow to bring scraps of bread and news to the woman who'd shown her kindness. On this bitter January morning, Hope approached the cabin with growing concern. No smoke from the chimney for the second day. No answer to her knocks yesterday. Miss Eleanor? Hope called, tapping timidly on the door. The silence that answered carried a weight that even a child could recognize. 50 miles away in Bozeman, Ethan Hayes sat through a cattle auction, unable to focus on the proceedings. His mind kept returning to a cabin in the hills, to a woman too proud to ask for help, to the growing certainty that something was wrong. Eleanor knew the signs of starvation, the constant gnawing hunger eventually fading to a strange euphoria. the dizziness when standing too quickly, the way her body began to consume itself, first fat, then muscle, finally organs. She had seen it during the war, when supply lines failed and civilians suffered most. She grew weaker. Hands shook when she lifted the hammer. Vision blurred, but she kept working. Because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking. The cold presented its own challenges. Eleanor preserved precious firewood by burning it only during the day, spending nights wrapped in every blanket she owned, her breath fogging in the freezing air. She slept with heated rocks at her feet, a frontier trick Daniel had taught her years ago. She measured the danger by how quickly water froze. A cup set outside would freeze in less than a minute on the worst days, when temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. On those days, exposed flesh would freeze in seconds, lungs would burn with each breath, and even wolves stayed in their dens. One bright spot appeared in Eleanor's darkening world. Hope, an 8-year-old orphan girl from town, began visiting secretly. Her parents had died in the smallpox outbreak of '76, leaving her in the reluctant care of the town doctor and his wife, who treated her more as servant than child. Hope brought scraps of bread when she could, sneaking away from chores to check on Miss Eleanor. The child had first appeared a month earlier, drawn by curiosity about the woman the town whispered about. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Eleanor had asked. "The town says I'm improper." Hope had shrugged small shoulders. "You gave me biscuits when I was hungry that time at the general store. No bad person shares food." The child's simple logic had brought the first smile to Eleanor's face in weeks. Now Hope visited every few days, bringing not just bread but news from town and, more importantly, company. "Mr. Hayes asks about you," Hope said one frigid afternoon. "He pretends not to, but he always listens when I talk about you." Eleanor's heart clenched. "You shouldn't tell him about me." "Why not? He cares about you, I can tell." "It's complicated, Hope." "Grown-ups always say that when they're being silly," the girl replied with the devastating insight of childhood. But one morning in late January, Eleanor didn't get up. The fire had died overnight, and she lacked the strength to rekindle it. Her cough had worsened, a deep rattle that spoke of fluid in the lungs. Pneumonia, the same killer that had taken Daniel. She lay by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, consciousness fading in and out. In her fevered state, she saw Daniel standing in the corner, beckoning. She saw Catherine as a child, laughing as she chased butterflies. She saw Ethan, his gray eyes concerned, reaching for her. "I'm too old to start again," she whispered to the empty room. Outside, snow continued to fall, burying the world in silence. Warren Pierce sat in Jack Turner's bank office, warming his hands at the small stove. January in Montana demanded concessions even from men who considered themselves above nature's whims. "The Sullivan claim," Pierce said without preamble. "I want it." Turner, a thin man with calculating eyes, steepled his fingers. "It's not for sale. I already told you that. Everything's for sale. The question is price." Pierce smiled, showing those two perfect teeth. "I understand the widow has overextended herself. Might be in arrears on her taxes." Turner frowned. "Her taxes are current, I checked. For now. But survival through winter requires resources. Resources I suspect she lacks." Pierce leaned forward. "I'm prepared to file abandonment papers. The Homestead Act is quite clear about continuous residency requirements. She hasn't abandoned the claim. She's living there." "Is she? Reports say she's ill, possibly dying. Hasn't been seen in town for weeks." Turner's frown deepened. "Who's reporting this?" Pierce waved a dismissive hand. "Various sources. The point is, the law allows claims to revert when not actively maintained. I simply want first option when that happens." "And why do you want that particular piece of land, Mr. Pierce? There's plenty available in the territory." Pierce's smile never reached his eyes. "Let's just say I represent interests that find that location strategic." Turner had been in banking long enough to recognize a man hiding his true purpose. He'd also been in Pine Creek long enough to hear rumors about railroad surveys, about lines potentially coming through the northern pass, precisely where Eleanor Sullivan's claim sat. "I can't help you, Mr. Pierce. If Mrs. Sullivan chooses to sell, that's her business, but I won't be party to forcing her hand." Pierce stood, brushing imaginary dust from his immaculate suit. "A shame. I thought we might understand each other, as businessmen." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Perhaps these might change your mind." Turner took the documents, scanned them, his face paling. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter? What matters is that I have them. Proof of certain lending irregularities at your bank. Nothing criminal, I'm sure, just questionable. Turner swallowed. This is blackmail. This is business, Mr. Turner. I need a local signatory on certain documents, someone respectable to testify regarding the Sullivan property status. You need these papers to disappear. Pierce took his hat from the rack. Think it over. I'll return tomorrow for your answer. After Pierce left, Turner sat motionless, staring at the damning papers. They detailed loans he'd approved despite insufficient collateral, mostly to local farmers who'd fallen on hard times after the Panic of '73. Nothing illegal, as Pierce had said, but certainly enough to cost him his position if the bank's directors in Helena saw them. Turner had a decision to make, and like most men, when forced to choose between self-preservation and principle, he found principle remarkably flexible. But Jack Turner had a secret that Warren Pierce couldn't know. 20 years earlier, Turner had lost his family farm in Ohio to men just like Pierce, speculators who manipulated the law to serve their greed. He'd sworn then never to become such a man. He also knew something else, something few in Pine Creek realized. Eleanor Sullivan wasn't just any widow struggling to survive. Before coming west, she had worked in the Pennsylvania County Records Office, developing an expertise in property law that surpassed most frontier lawyers. Turner had discovered this during their single meeting when she'd asked pointed questions about territorial statutes that revealed a sophisticated understanding. Turner made his decision. That evening, after closing the bank, he rode not to his comfortable home but to the Hayes Ranch. Ethan deserved to know what was coming. Ruth Miller had had enough. After church on the last Sunday in January, she waited until most of the congregation had departed, then approached Sarah Willard, Martha Jenkins, and Rebecca Palmer. Women she knew had their own reasons to question Reverend Thomas's judgments. I visited Eleanor Sullivan yesterday, Ruth said without preamble. She's ill, possibly dying, and we've done nothing. Sarah Willard, a young widow who had been pressured into remarriage with a man known for his cruel temper, looked down. What can we do? The Reverend has made his position clear. The Reverend isn't God, Ruth replied, surprising herself with her boldness. And I don't recall Christ ever turning his back on those in need. Martha Jenkins, at 62, the oldest of the women, nodded slowly. Ruth's right. I lost my farm to my son after my Charles died. He said a woman couldn't manage alone. Now I live in his back room, caring for his children, with no say in my own life. And I had to give up teaching when I married, added Rebecca Palmer, 43 and mother of 5, as if marriage somehow erased my knowledge, as if a woman can't be both wife and teacher. The women looked at each other, recognizing a shared understanding that transcended the differences in their ages and stations. They had all, in various ways, felt the weight of expectations that limited what a woman could or should do. What do you propose? Asked Sarah. We help her, Ruth said simply. We bring food, medicine, firewood. We say it's for sewing lessons if anyone asks. The men won't approve, Martha warned. Ruth straightened her shoulders. Then we don't tell them. Women have kept secrets since Eve. They laughed, a small shared moment of rebellion. The next day, Ruth led a small party of women to Eleanor's cabin, bringing supplies hidden in sewing baskets and under loaves of bread. They found Eleanor semi-conscious, burning with fever, the cabin cold as a tomb. Get water boiling, Ruth directed, taking charge with the natural authority of a school teacher. Martha, you know herbs. What do we need for the fever? The women worked efficiently, drawing on generations of knowledge passed from mother to daughter. They cleaned the cabin, built up the fire, prepared broth from supplies they'd brought, and made a poultice for Eleanor's chest from pine resin and willow bark. She needs a doctor, Rebecca said, bathing Eleanor's forehead with cool water. Dr. Willard won't come, Sarah replied bitterly. Not after what the Reverend said. Then we become her doctors, Martha declared. My grandmother was a healer in Kentucky. I know what to do. For 3 days, the women took turns staying with Eleanor, maintaining the fiction of sewing lessons to explain their absences from town. They spoke little of their own lives, of the compromises and constraints they'd accepted, but in caring for Eleanor, each found a small measure of the freedom they'd surrendered. On the 3rd day, Hope appeared, breathless from running through snow. The men are asking questions, she reported. Mr. Pierce especially. He asked Dr. Willard to certify that Mrs. Sullivan has abandoned her claim. Ruth exchanged worried glances with Martha. Pierce is moving faster than we expected. There's more, Hope continued. Mr. Ethan is doing something big. I don't know what, but all the ranch hands are gathering supplies. Did he send you with a message? Ruth asked. Hope shook her head. No, ma'am, he doesn't know I come here. I just listen when grown-ups talk. Ruth smiled despite her concern. You're a clever girl, Hope. Is Miss Eleanor going to die? The child's question hung in the air, direct as only a child's could be. Ruth looked at the unconscious woman, her breathing labored, her face gaunt. Not if we can help it, she said, hoping it wasn't a lie. At the Hayes Ranch, Ethan sat in the barn, staring at nothing. The cattle had been fed, the fences checked, the stock counted, but his mind was elsewhere. On a cabin in the hills, on a woman too stubborn to ask for help. Jack Turner's visit the previous evening had confirmed his worst fears. Pierce was moving to claim Eleanor's land, using legal technicalities about abandonment and continuous occupancy. The fact that she was ill, possibly dying, meant nothing to a man like Pierce. Turner had brought documents, property records showing exactly why Eleanor's claim mattered, why Pierce wanted it so badly. The creek that ran through her land controlled water access to 3 valleys. The natural pass would save the railroad miles of track and thousands in construction costs. It was worth a fortune to the right interests. Turner had also brought something else, something unexpected. A legal counter-strategy based on territorial precedents that might block Pierce's maneuvers. But it required Eleanor's signature on documents, her physical presence at a land hearing. In her current state, neither seemed possible. Old Henry found Ethan in the barn, still sitting motionless. At nearly 70, Henry Jackson had seen more of life's cruelties and kindnesses than most. He had been born a slave in Mississippi, fought it for the Union during the war, and made his way west, where a man's worth was measured less by his color than by his competence. He had worked for Ethan for 15 years and knew him better than anyone. That woman's going to die of stubbornness, Henry said without preamble. And you're going to die of regret, which is worse. Ethan looked at his foreman. Henry was 70 if he was a day, with a face like old leather and eyes that had seen everything. I don't know, Ethan admitted. Yes, you do. Henry's voice was gentle but firm. Sarah wouldn't want you to live alone forever, and she sure wouldn't want you to let another good woman die if you could prevent it. The mention of Sarah, so direct, so honest, broke something in Ethan. In 10 years, few had dared speak her name to him, as if his grief were a sleeping bear best left undisturbed. Eleanor sent me away, Ethan said, his voice rough. Said she wouldn't ruin my reputation. Henry snorted. Folks been talking about me since I was born. Talking don't kill you. What would you have me do? What you know is right, Henry replied. That's all any man can do. That night, Ethan loaded a wagon. Food, blankets, firewood, medicine. Everything Eleanor needed and wouldn't ask for. He was hitching the horses when he heard small footsteps behind him. Mr. Hayes? He turned. Hope, the 8-year-old orphan girl who helped in the ranch kitchen, stood in her nightgown, barefoot in the snow. Hope, what are you doing out here? You'll freeze. Miss Eleanor ain't answered her door in 2 days, sir, the child said, her voice trembling. I brought her bread yesterday and the day before. She didn't come out. Ethan's blood went cold. How do you know? About Eleanor? I check on her. She gave me biscuits once when I was hungry. I didn't tell nobody. Hope's voice trembled. I'm scared, Mr. Hayes. The ladies from town have been helping, but today Miss Eleanor wouldn't wake up. Ethan knelt down. You did right telling me. Now get inside before you catch cold. He stood, a decision crystallizing. And pack a bag. You're coming with me. Hope's eyes widened. To Miss Eleanor's? Yes. And then we're bringing her here to the ranch. She needs more help than we can give at her cabin. But what about what people will say? Ethan smiled grimly. Let them talk. Sometimes doing what's right means letting people think you're wrong. He finished hitching the horses in record time. Hope returned, wrapped in a coat too large for her small frame, clutching a cloth bundle of her few possessions. Mr. Dawson says I can't go, she said, referring to the ranch cook who nominally supervised her. Says it ain't proper. You let me worry about Mr. Dawson, Ethan replied, lifting her into the wagon. You just worry about staying warm under those buffalo robes. They rode through the night, through snow and wind and darkness. The temperature fell to 30 below, the kind of cold that killed unwary travelers. Ethan kept the team moving at a steady pace, not too fast to risk missing the trail, not too slow to risk freezing in place. Hope huddled under the robes, occasionally pointing the way when drifts obscured the path. She had traveled between town and Eleanor's cabin often enough to know landmarks even in darkness. A lightning-struck pine, a boulder shaped like a bear, The creek bend where ice never quite formed due to a hot spring beneath. Please, Ethan thought as he drove, his fingers numb despite heavy gloves. Please let her be alive. They reached the cabin at dawn. The door was closed, no smoke from the chimney. Ethan's heart sank. He helped Hope down from the wagon, then approached the cabin. He knocked, not expecting an answer. When none came, he tried the door. It was secured, though not with a proper lock, just the wooden latch Eleanor had fashioned. Stand back, he told Hope. Then he pushed hard against the door, the makeshift latch splintering under his weight. The solid door, the one they had built together and she had nailed into place to keep him out, now swung open to reveal darkness in a bone-deep cold. It swung open to reveal darkness in a bone-deep cold that told him the fire had been out for days. Eleanor lay by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, unconscious. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow. Ethan knelt beside her, felt for a pulse, present but weak and rapid. Hope, build a fire. Use the kindling in my pack. The girl moved quickly, gathering materials with the competence of a child long responsible for adult tasks. Ethan lifted Eleanor gently. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and determination. Her skin burned with fever even as her extremities were cold to the touch. Pneumonia, like Daniel. The cruel irony might have made her laugh if she'd been conscious to appreciate it. You can hate me later, he whispered as he carried her to the wagon. Right now, you're going to live. He wrapped her in buffalo robes, then climbed up beside her, cradling her against his chest for warmth. Hope joined them, wedging her small body against Eleanor's other side, adding her child's heat to the effort. Will she die? Hope asked, her voice small. Ethan looked down at Eleanor's face, at the woman who'd faced a Montana winter alone rather than compromise his reputation. No, he said with more certainty than he felt. She's too stubborn to die. They set off for the ranch, the wagon moving slower now with its precious cargo. Ethan kept one arm around Eleanor, feeling each shallow breath, each feeble heartbeat. With his free hand, he guided the team through deepening snow. Come on, Eleanor, he murmured against her hair. We've only just begun. Don't quit on me now. Behind them, the cabin stood empty, the door hanging open, silent witness to a woman's courage and a man's determination. Ahead lay the Hayes Ranch, and a future neither had dared imagine might still be possible. You said you were too old to start again, Ethan told the unconscious woman. But I still say, let's begin anyway. 2 weeks later, Eleanor woke in a bed that wasn't hers. Soft mattress, clean sheets, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, a glass of water on the bedside table. For a moment, she thought she had died, that this strange comfort was the afterlife. Then pain reasserted itself, her chest aching with each breath, her body weak from illness and starvation. She tried to sit up. Her body protested, muscles trembling with the effort. The door opened, and Ethan entered carrying a tray. Soup, bread, tea. He stopped when he saw her awake, relief washing over his weathered face. You're back, he said simply. Eleanor looked around, disoriented. Where am I? My ranch. You've been here 2 weeks. He set the tray down on a small table and moved to help her sit up, arranging pillows behind her with unexpected gentleness. Doctor said it was close. Pneumonia, fever, starvation. Memory returned in fragments. The cold cabin, the emptying pantry, the door she had nailed shut to keep Ethan away, to protect his reputation at the cost of her life. Hope? She asked, remembering the child's face, a dim impression from her fevered state. She's here. Refuses to leave your side most days. Had to send her to help in the kitchen so she'd get some rest herself. Eleanor nodded, then looked down at herself, suddenly aware that she wore a clean nightgown, not her own. Her hair had been washed, braided. The women from town, Ethan explained, following her gaze. Ruth Miller and some others. They've been taking turns sitting with you, helping with... He gestured vaguely, clearly uncomfortable discussing female matters. Why, Eleanor asked, her voice rough from disuse. After what the town said about us? Ethan's jaw tightened. Not everyone agreed with Reverend Thomas. Seems the women especially had their own thoughts on the matter. He brought the tray to her, setting it across her lap. The soup was rich with beef and vegetables, the bread still warm from the oven. Eleanor realized she was ravenous, but her hands shook too badly to hold the spoon steadily. Without comment, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and took the spoon himself. He fed her slowly, patiently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a man like him to perform such an intimate service. "Why did you come to town?" he asked after she had eaten half the soup. "You knew you were running out of supplies." Eleanor looked away. "Pride's a poor blanket in a hard winter." "Damn right it is. I told you to leave me alone," she said, meeting his eyes again. "And I did. And you almost died." His voice was level, but she could hear the anger beneath it, banked like coals. "I've lost enough, Eleanor. I'm not losing you too." She swallowed hard. "You don't owe me anything." "This ain't about owing." He set the spoon down, took her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady against her cold fingers. "I'm done caring what people think. I'm done living half a life because I'm afraid to try again." Ethan's gray eyes held hers, direct and honest as always. "I love you," he said simply, "and I think you love me too." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. "So the question is," he continued, "are we going to let a bunch of small-minded gossips decide our lives, or are we going to decide for ourselves?" Eleanor studied him, not just the weathered face and work-scarred hands, but the man who'd respected her enough to leave when she asked, then loved her enough to return when she needed. The irony wasn't lost on her. All her life she'd been defined by others: daughter, wife, mother, widow. Now, at 58, she was finally being offered the chance to define herself. "I'm scared," she whispered, admitting the fear she'd carried since Daniel died, since the farm was lost, since Catherine turned her back. "Me too." Ethan's honesty was refreshing in its simplicity. "What if we fail? Then we fail together." He smiled, a gentle curving of lips that had forgotten the expression until she taught them to remember. "But what if we don't?" Eleanor closed her eyes, felt the warmth of his hand, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, the quiet certainty that this man was worth the risk. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's begin anyway." That afternoon, Jack Turner arrived at the Hayes Ranch, his banker's satchel bulging with papers. He nodded to Ethan, then looked surprised to see Eleanor sitting in a chair by the window, wrapped in blankets but alert, color returning to her hollowed cheeks. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, genuine relief in his voice. "I'm glad to see you recovering." "Mr. Turner," she acknowledged. "Ethan says you have information about Warren Pierce." Turner nodded, taking a seat and opening his satchel. "Pierce is working for the Union Pacific Railroad, though unofficially. They're planning a new spur line through the northern pass, right where your claim sits." "Explains his interest," Eleanor murmured. "There's more. Your land controls water access to 3 valleys. In Montana, water rights are as valuable as gold. Pierce knows this. He's been buying up surrounding parcels through shell companies, preparing to control the entire watershed." Eleanor's mind, still sharp despite her illness, quickly grasped the implications. "And my claim is the keystone." "Precisely." Turner spread maps on the table beside her. "Without your land, his entire scheme collapses." Ethan stood behind Eleanor's chair, a protective presence. "He's trying to claim abandonment." "Yes." Turner pulled out a legal document. "The Homestead Act requires continuous residency and improvement of the land. Pierce is arguing that your absence from the cabin, coupled with your illness, constitutes abandonment." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "He's wrong. The law allows for temporary absence due to illness or emergency." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had studied such matters professionally. Tappan v. United States Land Office, 1871. The Supreme Court ruled that intent to return matters more than physical presence. Turner looked impressed. "You know your property law, Mrs. Sullivan." "I worked in the county records office in Pennsylvania after Daniel died." Eleanor's mouth set in a determined line. "I know exactly what Pierce is trying to do, and I know how to stop him." For the next hour, they pored over documents, strategies, precedents. Turner had brought territorial statutes, court decisions, maps showing survey lines and watercourses. Eleanor, despite her weakness, engaged fully, her mind clearly accustomed to legal complexities. Ethan watched in amazement as this side of Eleanor emerged, a sharp intellect hidden behind the facade of a simple widow. She cited cases, questioned details, proposed counter-arguments with the precision of a trained attorney. "There's one problem," Turner said finally. "The quarterly land hearing is tomorrow. Pierce has already filed his petition. You need to be physically present to contest it." Eleanor exchanged glances with Ethan. "Then I'll be there." "You can barely stand," Ethan protested. "I've done more with less," she replied, her jaw set in the stubborn line he had come to recognize and, against all reason, to love. Turner looked between them, then nodded. "I'll prepare the final documents for your signature." And Mrs. Sullivan, I must say, it's a pleasure to meet someone who truly understands the intricacies of territorial law. After Turner left, Eleanor slumped in her chair, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. You don't have to do this, Ethan said quietly. We could just let Pierce have the land. Start over somewhere else. Eleanor shook her head. That land is mine. I've put my blood and tears into it. I won't let a man like Pierce take it just because he thinks I'm too weak to fight. She looked up at Ethan. Besides, I'm tired of starting over. I want to finish what we began. Ethan knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Then we'll finish it together. That evening, Hope bounded into the room, her small face alight with excitement. Miss Eleanor, you're sitting up. Hello, little one, Eleanor smiled, genuinely pleased to see the child. I hear you've been watching over me. I helped bathe your forehead when you had fever, Hope said proudly, and I learned to make willow bark tea for pain, like my mama used to. Eleanor's heart contracted at the casual mention of Hope's lost mother. This child, orphaned so young, had still found ways to care for others, to maintain the human connections that sustain life beyond mere survival. Thank you, Eleanor said, opening her arms. Hope came to her without hesitation, wrapping thin arms around Eleanor's neck. Over the child's shoulder, Eleanor met Ethan's eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. This child, this man, this unexpected family forming from the broken pieces of three separate lives. Can I stay? Hope asked suddenly, pulling back to look at Eleanor with solemn eyes. Here with you and Mr. Ethan? Dr. Willard says I'm a burden, and Mrs. Willard makes me sleep in the kitchen with the mice. Before Eleanor could respond, Ethan spoke. Yes, he said firmly. You can stay for as long as you want, Hope. This is your home now, if you'll have it. Hope's face transformed with joy, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. Really? Forever? Eleanor reached for Ethan's hand, finding it already reaching for hers. Forever, she confirmed. We're a family now, the three of us. Later, after Hope had gone to help with supper, Eleanor looked at Ethan. You didn't hesitate about Hope. Some decisions don't need thinking about, he replied simply. The girl needs a home. We need her. Seems clear enough to me. Eleanor nodded, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the blankets wrapped around her shoulders. This was what had been missing in the cabin she'd built with such determination. Not just walls and a roof, but people to fill the space with life and purpose. Tomorrow, she said, changing the subject, we face Pierce. Ethan's expression hardened. Tomorrow, he agreed, we fight. The Pine Creek Town Hall was packed for the quarterly land meeting. Every rancher, every shopkeeper, every gossip within 10 miles had come to witness what promised to be the most dramatic confrontation the small town had seen in years. The hall itself was the largest building in town, a simple structure with a pitched roof and rows of wooden benches. At the front, a raised platform held a table where the Territorial Land Commissioner, Judge Franklin, presided. Beside him sat the county clerk and the territory surveyor. Warren Pierce occupied the front row, immaculate in his tailored suit, surrounded by three men who appeared to be associates from Bozeman. His confident smile suggested a man who expected victory as his due. Reverend Osh Thomas sat nearby, his expression severe. Jack Turner occupied a middle bench, legal documents spread beside him. Ruth Miller and her group of women clustered toward the back, their presence unusual at such meetings, which were typically male affairs. At precisely 10 o'clock, Judge Franklin called the meeting to order. First item, he announced, consulting his docket, petition regarding abandonment of homestead claim filed by Warren Pierce against Eleanor Sullivan. Pierce rose smoothly. Your Honor, I submit that the Sullivan claim has been abandoned. The claimant has not been seen in town for over a month, and reliable witnesses report the cabin has stood empty for at least 2 weeks. He presented affidavits from several townspeople, including Dr. Willard, attesting to Eleanor's absence and presumed departure or death. Furthermore, Pierce continued, the Homestead Act requires continuous residency and improvement. Even before her disappearance, Mrs. Sullivan was failing to make adequate improvements to the claim, as these witness statements confirm. The judge nodded, reviewing the documents. These seem in order, Mr. Pierce. Do you wish to make a claim on this land, should abandonment be confirmed? I do, Your Honor. I have prepared the necessary filings. Pierce's smile widened fractionally. Very well. Is there anyone present to speak on behalf of Mrs. Sullivan, or is she herself present? A murmur ran through the crowd as the door at the back of the hall opened. Ethan Hayes entered, hat in hand, his presence enough to cause a stir. He walked slowly down the center aisle, every eye following his progress. Pierce's smile faltered slightly. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes has no legal standing in this matter. He is neither relative nor legal representative of Mrs. Sullivan. Judge Franklin peered over his spectacles. Is that correct, Mr. Hayes? What is your interest in this proceeding? Ethan reached the front of the room, his face impassive. Mrs. Sullivan has not abandoned her claim, Your Honor. She has been gravely ill, temporarily residing at my ranch while recovering. This is not abandonment under the law. Pierce snorted. Even if true, Mr. Hayes, this arrangement only confirms the improper relationship that has been the talk of Pine Creek for months. Hardly a legal defense. I'm not offering a defense, Ethan replied evenly. I'm simply stating facts. Eleanor Sullivan has improved her claim continuously since staking it. She has built a cabin, cleared land, established residency. She became ill due to circumstances beyond her control and was temporarily relocated for medical care. These are claims without evidence, Pierce countered. And again, Mr. Hayes has no standing to make them. He doesn't, came a clear voice from the back of the room. But I do. The crowd parted as Eleanor Sullivan made her way slowly down the aisle. She was thin, pale, clearly still recovering, but her back was straight, her head held high. Ruth Miller walked beside her, ready to offer support if needed, but Eleanor moved under her own power. A collective gasp rose from the assembly. Many had assumed her dead or departed. Pierce's face darkened with anger, quickly masked. Mrs. Sullivan, Judge Franklin said, surprise evident in his voice. We had reports you had abandoned your claim. Eleanor reached the front of the room, her gaze sweeping past Pierce to focus on the judge. Reports exaggerated, Your Honor, as you can see. I have been ill, but at no point did I intend to abandon my claim. The law requires physical presence, Pierce interjected. Intent is irrelevant. The law requires continuous residency with allowances for temporary absence, Eleanor corrected, her voice gaining strength. Tappan versus United States Land Office, 1871, established that temporary absence due to illness does not constitute abandonment. Furthermore, the Montana Territorial Statutes of 1868, Section 12, Paragraph 3, specifically allow for medical emergencies. Pierce's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting legal citations from a frontier widow. Judge Franklin looked impressed despite himself. You seem well versed in property law, Mrs. Sullivan. I worked in the Pennsylvania County Records Office for 7 years after my husband's death. Your Honor, I am familiar with homestead requirements. Eleanor gestured to Jack Turner, who approached with documents. Mr. Turner has prepared affidavits from Ruth Miller, Martha Jenkins, and others who tended to me during my illness, establishing continuous intent to maintain my claim. I also have documentation of improvements made, including materials purchased and labor contracted. Judge Franklin reviewed the papers carefully. These appear to be in order, Mrs. Sullivan. Mr. Pierce, your petition for abandonment seems premature at best. Pierce's jaw tightened. Your Honor, even if Mrs. Sullivan has not technically abandoned her claim, there is the matter of her ability to maintain it. A woman alone, especially one in poor health, cannot possibly meet the improvement requirements going forward. That's where you're wrong again, Eleanor said. She turned to face the crowd directly for the first time. I am not alone. She looked at Ethan, who stepped forward to stand beside her. Mr. Hayes and I intend to marry. We will maintain my claim together, as the law allows for family holdings. Another murmur swept through the hall, louder this time. Reverend Thomas rose to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. This is improper. This proposed union is clearly a convenience to circumvent legal requirements. Is love a convenience, Reverend? Eleanor asked quietly, her voice carrying in the suddenly silent room. Is finding someone who values you for your strength rather than despite it a mere legal strategy? She turned to the crowd. I am 58 years old. I have lived by society's rules my entire life. I was a dutiful daughter, a loyal wife, a devoted mother. I lost my husband, my farm, my daughter's respect. When I came here, I had nothing but determination and the will to begin again. Eleanor's gaze swept over the assembled townspeople. Some of you judged me for working alongside Ethan Hayes. You called it improper, immoral. You never stopped to think that perhaps what is truly immoral is allowing someone to suffer alone rather than risk your precious propriety. Her eyes found Ruth Miller and the women who had helped her. Others of you showed true Christian charity. You put kindness above judgment, humanity above rules. You remind me that even in the hardest places, goodness can take root. Finally, Eleanor looked at Ethan. This man helped me when no one else would. He respected my pride even when it nearly killed me. He taught me that it's never too late to begin again. She turned back to Judge Franklin. So yes, Your Honor, we intend to marry, not to satisfy the law or the reverend or the gossips of Pine Creek, but because we have found in each other something we thought was lost forever, a future worth building together. The silence that followed her words was profound. Even Pierce seemed momentarily at a loss. Judge Franklin cleared his throat. Well said, Mrs. Sullivan. As to the matter at hand, I find no evidence of abandonment that your claim remains valid. He fixed Pierce with a stern look. Petition denied. Pierce rose, his face a mask of controlled fury. This isn't over, Your Honor. There are other legal avenues. Perhaps, Judge Franklin interrupted, but I suggest you pursue them elsewhere. And Mr. Pierce, I would advise reviewing the territorial statutes regarding fraudulent claims and witness tampering. Some of these affidavits you've presented contain troubling inconsistencies. Pierce gathered his papers with sharp movements. You'll regret this, he muttered as he passed Eleanor. No, she replied calmly. I don't believe I will. As Pierce and his associates departed, the tension in the room broke. People began talking all at once, some approaching Eleanor and Ethan with congratulations, others slipping away, discomfited by the public rebuke of their judgment. Ruth Miller pushed through the crowd. You did it, she said, embracing Eleanor carefully, and you put a few self-righteous noses out of joint in the process. Not my intention, Eleanor smiled, but I won't pretend I'm sorry about it. Reverend Hon Thomas approached, his expression still disapproving but somewhat subdued. Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Hayes, I cannot condone how this situation developed. But, he hesitated, clearly struggling, I acknowledge that I may have been hasty in my judgment. The scriptures do tell us that charity is the greatest virtue. It was as close to an apology as the proud man could manage. Eleanor nodded, accepting it for what it was. We would be honored to have you perform our wedding ceremony, Reverend, if you're willing. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by a grudging respect. I will consider it, Mrs. Sullivan. As the crowd dispersed, Ethan took Eleanor's arm, supporting her as her strength began to flag. Ready to go home? He asked quietly. Yes, she said, home. Outside under the winter stars, Ethan and Eleanor stood by his wagon. Hope was already inside, wrapped in buffalo robes, half asleep after the excitement of the day. The town of Pine Creek lay behind them, lights glowing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys into the crystalline night. Still think you're too old? Ethan asked, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Too old to start alone. But with me, she squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone still recovering. Let's begin anyway. Ethan helped her into the wagon, arranging blankets around her with careful attention. Before climbing up himself, he paused, seeming to make a decision. Eleanor Sullivan, he said quietly, will you marry me? With one condition. Name it. We live in your cabin, the one we built together. Eleanor looked surprised. But your ranch? Henry can manage it, has been for years anyway. Ethan's expression was earnest. That cabin means something. To both of us. It's where we started. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Ethan climbed into the wagon beside her, taking the reins. Hope stirred, lifting her head from the nest of blankets. Are we going home now? Yes, little one, Eleanor said, stroking the child's hair. We're going home. They rode back to the Hayes Ranch that night, planning to return to Eleanor's cabin once she had regained more strength. Old Henry had lit a fire in the hearth, set out a simple supper. Smoke rose from the chimney, visible on the ridge, a beacon in the darkness. Home for now. Home together. Later that evening, after Hope had been tucked into bed, Eleanor and Ethan sat before the fire in his study. The room reflected the man, simple but thoughtful, walls lined with books that surprised many who assumed Ethan Hayes was just another rough rancher. Pierce won't give up easily, Eleanor said, breaking a comfortable silence. Men like him never do. Let him try, Ethan replied. We'll be ready. Eleanor studied Ethan's profile in the firelight, the strong lines of his face, the gray at his temples. When did you know, she asked. Know what? That you wanted this, us. Ethan considered the question with his usual careful deliberation. When I saw you fall and get back up that first day. When you refused my help but accepted my lumber. he smiled, when you teased me about those crooked nails. And you, when did you know? Eleanor looked into the flames. When you left because I asked you to, even though it was the last thing you wanted to do. She paused. You respected my choice, even when it was the wrong one. Daniel was a good man, a good husband, but he always thought he knew best what I needed. And I don't? Ethan asked, curious rather than offended. You know to ask, she replied. That makes all the difference. They sat together in companionable silence, the fire crackling, the wind singing around the eaves. Two people who had lived enough to value the quiet moments between the storms. Tell me about Sarah, Eleanor said finally, if you want to. Ethan tensed slightly, then relaxed. She was strong, funny, though she didn't let many people see it, loved books, hated sewing. He smiled at some private memory. She used to say God made her fingers too honest for needlework. Always stuck herself, cursed like a miner when she thought I couldn't hear. She sounds wonderful. She was. Ethan looked at Eleanor directly. She would have liked you. The simple statement held more meaning than 1,000 flowery declarations. It acknowledged the past without being trapped by it, honored what was lost while embracing what might yet be found. And Daniel, Ethan asked, what was he like? Gentle, Eleanor said immediately. Everyone thought soldiers came back hard from the war, but Daniel came back gentle, like he'd seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes. He loved growing things. Our farm was small, but every inch was tended like a garden. She smiled sadly. He talked to the plants, sang to them sometimes, said they grew better with music. And your daughter, Catherine? Eleanor's expression tightened. She was always more practical than either of us, even as a child. When Daniel died, she wanted me to sell immediately, move east with her and Charles. Said I was being stubborn, sentimental. She sighed. Maybe I was. I lost the farm anyway in the end. But you fought for it first, Ethan said, echoing his words from days before. There's honor in that. Is there, or just pride? Sometimes they're the same thing. The conversation circled back, finding its center. They were building something here, not just plans for a future, but understanding of the past that had shaped them both. What about Hope? Eleanor asked. Are we doing the right thing, taking her in so suddenly? The right thing is rarely the easy thing, Ethan replied. But yes, I believe we are. That child has seen too much loss already. She deserves a family, however unconventional. And we deserve her, Eleanor added softly. She reminds us why we're fighting, why we're building, not just for ourselves, but for what comes after. Ethan reached across the space between their chairs, took Eleanor's hand, their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that somehow contained promises no words could adequately express. Tomorrow, he said, we'll begin making plans. For the cabin, for the wedding, for everything. Tomorrow, Eleanor agreed, and all the tomorrows after. Spring came slowly to Montana territory. First the thaw, then the mud, then finally the wildflowers. Tiny bursts of purple and yellow pushing through the last patches of snow. By April, Eleanor was fully recovered, her strength returned, her body resilient despite the ordeal it had endured. The cabin that she and Ethan had built together underwent a transformation. With Ethan's resources and Eleanor's vision, they expanded the original structure, adding a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, a covered porch. The crooked nails in the door frame remained, a reminder of beginnings. Ethan split his time between the ranch and the cabin, with Henry managing daily operations. Eventually, they planned to bring the ranch headquarters closer to Eleanor's claim, combining their properties into a single operation. But for now, the arrangement worked. Hope flourished like the spring wildflowers, gaining weight, smiling more, gradually shedding the wariness that life had taught her too young. She attended the small school in Pine Creek where Ruth Miller taught, showing a quick mind and particular aptitude for mathematics. Each evening, the three of them sat at the table Eleanor had built during those desperate winter days. They shared meals, stories, plans for the future. Hope learned to play checkers, to whittle simple shapes from soft pine, to recognize the constellations in the night sky. Eleanor taught her to read from Ethan's books, while Ethan taught her to ride, to fish, to build a fire that would burn even in wet wood. Warren Pierce had departed Pine Creek after his defeat at the land hearing. Rumors placed him in Helena, still working for railroad interests, still pursuing legal channels to acquire Eleanor's claim. But with Jack Turner's help, Eleanor and Ethan had secured their legal position, filing additional documentation, that made their combined property holding virtually unassailable. The town's attitude had shifted as well. The wedding, performed by a surprisingly gracious Reverend Thomas in March, had been attended by most of Pine Creek. Ruth Miller and her circle of women had organized the celebration, while Ethan's ranch hands had provided music, food, and enough whiskey to ensure the event would be long remembered. Eleanor and Ethan's union had somehow bridged divides in the small community. The women who had secretly helped Eleanor during her illness now openly claimed her friendship. The men who had judged Ethan for his association with her now sought his advice on ranch matters, water management, livestock breeding. Even Dr. Willard, who had signed Pierce's fraudulent affidavit claiming Eleanor had abandoned her claim, eventually came to apologize, admitting he had been pressured and offering his medical services should they be needed in the future. One bright May morning, Eleanor knelt by the cabin's foundation, pressing seeds into the damp earth. She was creating a kitchen garden, something she had managed even during the hardest years on the Pennsylvania farm. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, herbs, all carefully arranged according to their needs for sun, water, and companionship with other plants. Ethan worked nearby, digging a proper irrigation channel from the creek, ensuring the garden would thrive even during the dry Montana summer months. Hope ran between them, collecting rocks, asking endless questions about plants, soil, water, the kinds of questions children ask when they finally feel secure enough to be curious about the world. "Miss Eleanor," Hope called, running up with a handful of purple wildflowers. "These look like the ones in your picture." Eleanor smiled, accepting the small bouquet. Hope referred to the daguerreotype Eleanor kept beside her bed, one of the few possessions she had brought from Pennsylvania. It showed a much younger Eleanor in a garden very like the one she now planted, wildflowers blooming around her, Daniel standing proud beside her. "Yes, they do," Eleanor agreed. "Prairie violets. They were always Daniel's favorites." Hope considered this information seriously. "Do you think Mr. Ethan would mind if we planted some by the porch?" "I think he'd like that very much." Hope ran off to present her idea to Ethan, who was taking a break, drinking water from a tin cup. Eleanor watched them talk, Ethan listening with the same serious attention he gave to adults, nodding at Hope's explanation. He glanced over at Eleanor, smiled, then took Hope's hand as they walked together to examine the perfect spot for violet transplants. The scene brought an unexpected tightness to Eleanor's throat. This family they had created from broken pieces, this life they were building together. It was nothing like what she had planned when she first came to Montana, when she drove her shovel into frozen earth and marked the corners of what would become this cabin. It was better. Ruth Miller came visiting that afternoon, bringing a wedding quilt she had only just finished, white and blue, stitched with care. The design incorporated elements from both Eleanor and Ethan's lives. Pennsylvania hex signs merged with Montana mountains. "I'm sorry it's so late," Ruth said, unfolding the quilt for Eleanor's inspection. "The pattern was more complicated than I anticipated." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, genuinely moved. "Far too fine for a frontier cabin." "Nonsense. Beauty belongs everywhere, especially in places carved from wilderness." Ruth smoothed a hand over the intricate stitching. "Besides, every home needs a proper wedding quilt. It's tradition." They sat on the new porch, drinking tea, watching Hope and Ethan working in the distance, transplanting violets according to some plan the child had devised. "You've created something remarkable here," Ruth observed. "Not just the cabin or the garden, but this family." Eleanor nodded. "From ruins," she said softly. "All three of us were broken in different ways. Somehow together we're whole again." "That's the truest kind of family," Ruth replied. "The one you build by choice, not just by blood." As they talked, a rider approached from the direction of town. Jack Turner, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his normally neat appearance marred by dust and haste. "Eleanor," he called, dismounting quickly, "I have news you need to hear." Ethan, spotting the banker, came in from the garden, Hope trailing behind him. "Turner, what's happened?" "A letter," Turner explained, producing an envelope from his coat. "From Catherine Sullivan Coleman, addressed to Eleanor Sullivan, care of the Pine Creek Bank." Eleanor's heart seemed to stop. "Catherine? My daughter?" Turner nodded, handing her the letter. "Arrived on yesterday's mail coach. I thought you'd want it right away." Eleanor stared at the envelope, her name written in the neat, precise handwriting she would know anywhere. Her daughter, who had not written in 3 years, who had told her not to write again, that she was an embarrassment. "Would you like privacy?" Ethan asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "No, whatever this contains affects all of us now." With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting remained neat at the beginning, but became increasingly irregular as the letter progressed, as if Catherine's emotions had overcome her usual control. Mother, Eleanor read aloud, I am writing to apologize. Charles's business ventures have failed one after another, and we have lost everything, much as you lost the farm. I understand now what you faced alone, and I am ashamed of how I judged you. Eleanor paused, steadying herself before continuing. The life I thought was secure has proven as fragile as spring ice. The society friends I valued above family have vanished with our fortune. I was wrong, Mother, wrong about so many things. Hope moved closer to Eleanor, leaning against her side in silent support. Ethan stood behind her chair, a hand on her shoulder. I have learned through inquiries that you have established yourself in Montana territory and that you have recently married. I am glad, truly glad, that you have found happiness. More than that, I am in awe of your courage to begin again at a time of life when most would simply surrender. Eleanor's voice faltered. Ethan squeezed her shoulder gently, encouraging her to continue. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it, but I would very much like to know you again, to learn from your strength. Charles and I are considering moving west ourselves, as there is nothing left for us here. Would it be possible, Mother, to visit you, to see this new life you have built? The letter ended with Catherine's signature, followed by a postscript. I have a son now, Thomas, age 2. He should know his grandmother. Silence fell after Eleanor finished reading. A grandson, a daughter who wanted reconciliation, another unexpected turn in a life that had already transformed beyond recognition. What will you do? Ruth asked gently. Eleanor looked up at Ethan, a question in her eyes. Family is family, he said simply. There's room here for healing. Eleanor nodded, then looked at Hope, who was watching with weird, uncertain eyes. Hope, how would you feel about meeting my daughter and her little boy? You'd be like a big sister to Thomas. Hope considered this seriously. Would they live with us? No, not with us, but perhaps nearby if they decide to come west. Hope nodded slowly. I think that would be all right. Everyone should have a chance to start again, shouldn't they? From the mouths of babes, Eleanor thought. Out loud, she said, yes, little one. Everyone deserves that chance. Later that evening, after Hope was asleep in the small room they had built especially for her, Eleanor and Ethan sat on the porch swing Henry had insisted on adding when they expanded the cabin. The night was cool but not cold, stars brilliant above the dark outline of mountains. I think I was angry at Catherine for so long, Eleanor said, watching fireflies rise from the meadow grasses. Angry that she couldn't understand why I fought for the farm, why I couldn't just surrender everything Daniel and I had built. And now? Ethan asked. Now I see that she was afraid of poverty, of judgment, of the precarious nature of a woman's position in this world. Eleanor sighed. Fear makes people cruel sometimes. I should know. I sent you away out of fear. Ethan rocked the swing gently with his foot. We all have our demons. The brave ones face them eventually. Like Catherine is doing now? Like Catherine. Like you. Like me, when I finally admitted I couldn't bear to lose anyone else I loved. Eleanor leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Do you think she'll actually come? Catherine and her family? I think a woman with your blood in her veins doesn't make empty gestures. Eleanor smiled at that. Perhaps you're right. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds, the creak of the swing, distant coyotes calling to the moon. I thought I was too old, Eleanor said quietly. Too old to start again. Too old to build something lasting. Too old to find love. Ethan looked down at her, his expression soft in the starlight. And now? Now I know better. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining as they had that night by the fire, a simple gesture containing universes of meaning. Age isn't about years. It's about willingness to begin, even when beginning seems impossible. Eleanor Hayes, Ethan said, using her new name with evident pleasure. Are you ready to begin again tomorrow? She smiled up at him, this man who had watched her from a ridge, who had brought lumber when she needed it most, who had respected her pride and then saved her life. This man who had taught her that family could be built from ruins, that love could bloom in winter, that it was never too late to start again. Every single day, she answered. Outside, the wildflowers bloomed through the melting snow. The cabin stood strong, and the door, the one they'd built together with its crooked nails and hard-won threshold, stood open to the spring. She'd said she was too old, but standing here home-built, heart-healed, hand-held, she knew the truth. It's never too late to begin. Not when you've got someone to begin with.